Well, good evening, everybody. Hello from North London. My name is Dr. Daniel Glaser. I'm the Director of Science Engagement at the Royal Institution. It gives me enormous pleasure to be speaking on publication day of his new book, I've Been Thinking, to the fabulous, renowned and brilliant philosopher, Dan Dennett. So welcome to Dan. And Dan, would you like to begin at the beginning? Is it fair to ask you at the top when you came up with the idea, either for the title of or the book itself? How did it feel, or how did you come to write this particular book, which is, as it were, a retrospective of the philosophical processes that you've been through, you know, as a man, as it were?
Well, it struck me that I've been extremely lucky and had more adventures than any philosopher could ever claim to deserve. And they've been wonderful intellectual adventures. And I got reflecting on how I got that way. Is it all just luck? Or do I have something to tell people about how to think better and have more adventures like the ones that I've had? And so this is my attempt to provide some informal tutorial help and how I've been thinking over the years and the mistakes I've made and how I use my thinking to catch the mistakes of others. So it's a how-to talk. This is for DIY thinkers.
Very good. And I mean, yeah, I guess when it comes to thinking, we don't have many other options, I guess. But and so, look, folks, Dan's asked, and I would echo this, that if there are things that occur to you as we're going, do drop them into the chat. I'll be sort of, subject to cognitive load, be monitoring that on the side. Dan's already, stated an aim for this, that it's supposed to help others to think better based on his experience. And you can ask us at the end or chip in as we go as to whether you find that helpful yourself. Dan, having gone to the trouble for us of preparing a PowerPoint, would you like to show us, as it were, your first slide? And I guess
in fact, I'll probably show a few. So here we go. This line, it seemed like a good idea at the time, is a sort of joke line about some poor sap who's made some terrible mistake, and this is the rueful reflection. But I've been saying for some time, no, this is a sign of intelligence. If you can say and mean, it seemed like a good idea at the time, it means, one, you can remember how it seemed at the time. You've got memory, and you can reflect on why it seemed like a good idea at the time. And you can, in effect, debug your own thinking to some degree by going back over it and seeing, well, if it wasn't a good idea, why did I think it was a good idea? And how can I avoid doing that again? So this is the first line of self-tutoring, self-criticism that I want to stress. You should actually get in the habit of going back over your own thinking and saying, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Now, why is that? So that's an important starting point, I think. And of course, it's very important to make mistakes and to savor them. You should become a connoisseur of your mistakes, because mistakes are the way we make progress. In fact, that's almost tautological, I think. Almost every learning experience starts off with some little kind of mistakes, in the same way that all the designing that happens in nature starts with a mistake. It starts with mutations. It starts with things that weren't done on purpose, didn't have any point, and now we have to deal with the aftermath of them. And evolution by natural selection is a great, wonderful machine for exploiting mistakes. And scientific thinking is as well. So is philosophical thinking. There's a line that people in programming, computer science often use. It isn't a bug, it's a feature. And that could be nature's slogan. Most mutations that occur for no reason at all. They're just random mutations, are bugs. They're mistakes. They do not enhance any project or any life form, but every now and then it isn't a bug, it's a feature. It turns out to be something that can be put to better use. And that's how evolution works, and that's how science works. And I want to try to drive home that point in this talk. One of my favorite quotations comes from the great physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who dissed the work of some other physicists by saying it isn't even wrong. And yeah, this is a great point. There are plenty of people whose thinking on various topics isn't even wrong. It's just not worth thinking about. But Pauli saw that if something is constructively wrong, provocatively wrong, irritatingly wrong, this can actually be a way to make progress. So I hope I make a lot of mistakes today and we can all learn from them. Making mistakes and benefiting from the results is one of the best methods there is. And the more you know, the better mistakes you can make. That's why so much of philosophical thinking is, quite frankly, hardly worth discussing, because a lot of philosophers make it a point not to know very much about the aspects of the world that they're dealing with. They think they can do it all from the armchair. And if they do that, the mistakes they make are not going to be very interesting, because usually they're just factual errors. They're just wrong about something because they've made the philosophical mistake, which is mistaking failures of imagination for insights into necessity. You think, ooh, that just can't be it. This is absolutely necessary that it be otherwise. No, you just haven't thought about it well enough. If you knew a little bit more about the field, you'd realize that you're making a mistake. I'll try to point out a few of those along the way. Now, this is a photograph that I took some years ago at my farm of one of the walls in the tool shed, and it just shows a lot of my tools. And that's what my mind looks like to me. That's how I think of my mind. It's a jumble of tools. Some of them are obsolete. Some of them I made myself. They all have their uses and misuses. And it's important to be able to find the right tool when you need it. I'm just going to point out a few over here. Let's see if I can get my cursor to do this. Can I get my cursor? Oh, there it is. There it is. That right there, that's a blueberry press that I made. I tried to make blueberry wine, and I couldn't crush the berries until I made this roller arrangement, my own design. I'm quite proud of my blueberry press. This is my cider press here. This is a winnower, or you might say a cherry picker. Winnowers, very important invention in the history of agriculture. You couldn't really have agriculture without ways of winnowing.
What's winnowing, Dan?
Winnowing is just separating the wheat from the chaff, or separating the berries from the stems, or separating the good ideas from the bad. It's a process of generate and test, where you make you gather a lot of stuff up, and there's a lot of junk in it, and you got to get rid of that junk. And
I love the idea that you've got a working blueberry press and winnower, but no working internet in your home.
Yes,
That's
right now.
A nice reflection.
Yes.
And just to be clear, for those that don't know, Dan, just not to interrupt you too much, but you do spend quite a lot of time in your shed, right? I mean, that's not the sort of thing that you do only in the holidays.
Yeah, this was at the farm that I was a hobby farmer at for years, for over 40 years. But we sold this a few years ago, and we're no longer at the farm. I want to point out this axe right here. Because, notice too, by the way, there's some perfectly modern tools. I don't disdain modern technology when it's available. So what's interesting about an axe Well, if you were to look at the sharpened edge of a really good axe, and if you were to look at it with a microscope, it would look like the Rocky Mountains. It would be jagged and scary, but it's not the jagged edge that explains the success of the axe. It's the huge weight of metal in the rest of the axe head that drives that blade in to do the work. And this is a metaphor I like for science. At the cutting edge of science, it's chaotic. There are big egos, there's fights, there's battles, there's all kinds of disagreement. But behind that, and bringing the power of science to bear, is the dull weight of all the accumulated results that have arrived. And without that dull weight of the axe head behind the cutting edge wouldn't be worth very much. So there's a picture of my workshop. How do I find what tools I need when I need them? This is a tough question. It's one that goes back to Plato. In the Theaetetus, Plato has this passage where he likens having knowledge to having a whole lot of birds in an aviary. And he says, all right, they're your birds, you've got them. But the main thing is, can you get the right ones to come when you call? And that is one of the fundamental problems of knowledge. Not how many things do you know, but how can you get the right knowledge, the knowledge that's relevant, the knowledge that matters? How can you get it to come to you when you need it? And that's an art that I hope to shed a little light on, because I think there's no algorithm, there's no recipe for how to do that. This is where we are thrown back on methods that are as much artistic as scientific. Now, here's my friend Doug Hofstadter. He and I collaborated on a book, The Mind's Eye, back in the 80s. And the reason I want to lead with Doug was that when I first heard about Doug, when I first heard about his famous book, Gödel Eschenbach, I was prejudiced against it. I thought, oh, this is one of these West Coast woo-woo people. And I sort of turned up my nose. I didn't even want to read the book, but fortunately, a more open-minded philosopher said, go read it. Yeah, I think you'll like it. And so I did. And then I met him and we decided to work together. And thank goodness for that, because it was, I think Doug Hofstadter has been one of the major influences on my life. But I also want to point out that there's an awful lot of people in the sciences that have their minds set against Doug's way of thinking, his style, his manner. They just think this is not serious. This is not what science should be. And I think, on the contrary, minds like Doug's contribute more to science than many more dignified, stodgy, rule-bound minds that populate the sciences. Doug's on the cutting edge. A lot of the others are content, and that's their business, with filling in the blanks back in the hefty weight of the axe head without actually being on the cutting edge.
And I'll take your invitation to just quickly come in on this. So again, what I'm hearing is that you've got a range of tools that you've used to apply, and I'm not sure whether you're considering the people that will crop up in this talk as being, within the category of tools, or whether there are, two different categories, tools and people, that you need to deploy in order to do good science. We'll come back to whether it's science or philosophy perhaps in a minute.
Well, people you can use people as tools. I like to say I loved using Jerry Fodor as a sort of trampoline. If I can see farther than others, because I'm jumping on Jerry.
Not on the shoulders of giants, but on the trampoline of
yeah, exactly.
And just for those that don't know, Dan, would we consider? I mean, again, we'll come back perhaps to the question of whether you're a scientist or a philosopher. I know it's one that you get asked a lot. For people who don't know, Doug Hofstadter, was sort of thought of as a writer, as a journalist, as an author, as much as a scientist per se. Do you want to argue or discuss about that, or would that be an unfair question?
Let me say a word about it. I'm glad you asked. Now, Doug has a PhD in physics, and he's made some important contributions to theoretical physics. He's a computer scientist. He's the head of a cognitive science group at Indiana University. Not a journalist. He's also an artist and a translator and a poet and many other things. He's a thinker. And one of his favorite terms, which I would like to see more widely used, is Joosting. What is Joosting? Well, it stands for jumping out of the system. Doug argues that Joosting is the key to success if you want to be original, whether as a musician or as a poet or as a scientist. Well, in order to jutes, you have to know what the system is. So you have to be trained in the system. If you don't know the system, you don't know what you're jumping out of. So it's very important to get fully endowed with all the rules and regulations of a system of thought. And then you can start thinking about ways of jutsing, of jumping out of the system. And through meeting Doug, this created a chain for me, because when we were working on the mind's eye, Doug wanted to include a selection from Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. And when that book came out, I had asked a colleague, a friend, an eminent philosopher of biology, what about this book? And he dismissed it as pop biology. It's just a trade pop book, not worth reading. And when I said that to Doug, he said, well, you read a bit of it and see what you think. And I read The Selfish Gene at Doug's insistence, and it changed my life. And Richard Dawkins became one of my good friends and favorite scientists, and I've been working with Richard now off and on many things for decades. But I wouldn't have gotten to him if it hadn't been for Doug canceling the prejudice that I had for him, which had been illicitly passed to me by an academic that I trusted a little too much, I guess.
Very interesting. Also, and by the way, first of all, to observe that you're doing that kind of Tarzan-like thing, aren't you, of swinging, as it were, from vine to vine in terms of the chain of people that you've been connected to. But again, just from the perspective of the Royal Institution, as you know, Dan, the RI since 1799 has been absolutely committed to the engagement of the public with science. And I love the fact that you were forced to correct your initial prejudice against a book because it had been designed to be read by a popular audience. And again, Doug, and you will forgive me for calling him a journalist, but he's certainly somebody who's committed to being understood. And I do think that prejudice against being understood, as if that marks out your thought as being somehow not serious, is something we have to resist.
And it's something that I've dealt with my whole career. I deliberately wrote trade books like content, like Consciousness Explained and Darwin's Dangerous Idea. They were really intended for my colleagues, but I realized that if I didn't write them in a more accessible manner, we'd talk past each other. This is the right level sometimes for everybody to work. So Doug introduced me to Dawkins and The Selfish Gene, and that introduced me to memes. And memes is another term that has now of course, gone viral, as one would say, of a meme. The term itself has gone viral. But a lot of people don't realize what an important coinage this is, how important the idea of cultural items that have their own evolutionary system, that evolved by natural selection, in some regards, quite independently of our genes and quite independently of our own thinking. There are memes that evolve, that change, that we don't even notice are evolving and changing. They are using us the way viruses use us. They are using us to copy them. And some of them are more successful at getting us to copy them than others. And those are the ones that have higher fitness. If there's one point that Dawkins has made again and again, and I think it's still not appreciated by many really serious thinkers, it's that memes have their own fitness, just the way viruses do. There are viruses that are good for us. There are, in fact. There are viruses that are bad for us, and there's trillions of viruses that are neither good nor bad for us. But they just use us as their replicating machineries, as their copy machines. And the same thing is true of memes. They have their own fitness, and we should never forget it. There's Richard. He has I'll tell a little funny story about Richard. When I started writing about memes, he said, when you mention them, don't mention my name. Don't say it's my coinage. Why is that? I said. And he said, because if you mention the coinage, then it doesn't count for getting the word into the OED, into the Oxford English Dictionary. And he wanted the word to make it into the OED, as it has done. But now I can go back and say, yeah, and he's the one who coined it. Coined words are pretty rare, but he coined a good one, and I'm still defending it against a rather daunting array of doubters, even within evolutionary theory, who still, I think, don't appreciate his thinking for the power that it is. There have been a lot of doctrinal forces arrayed against him, which is unfortunate. I'm switching to Ruth Millikan. Now, nobody had to draw me to Ruth Millikan but Ruth herself. She bravely sent me a paper and then the manuscript of her first book. And that was at a time when I wasn't being inundated with these from others. And I read it, I thought, my gosh, I think she's onto something. So I got on the bandwagon and encouraged her, and that led her to write her wonderful book, Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories, and a whole series, a slew of later books. And I think she's one of the most original philosophers in the world. But again, there are lots of eminent philosophers of language in the analytic tradition who have to be dragged kicking and screaming before they'll take her work seriously. Well, I think they'll regret that sooner or later. I am, by the way, on my way to a special celebration of her work tomorrow, starting at her university, where she is emeritus at the University of Connecticut. Giulio Tononi has recently been much in the news for his integrated information theory, or IIT. Now, I've known Giulio for over 20 years, well, 30 years. And many years ago, he outlined his integrated information theory for me and invited me to get on his team and help him with this. And I thought about it good and hard and talked to mathematician friends of mine, and we went through it pretty carefully. And I decided, no, I didn't think this was an idea that I wanted to support, but there were some things about it that I found attractive. Well, just a few weeks ago, a letter was signed by dozens, I don't know, maybe even 100 researchers in cognitive science of consciousness, calling Tononi's IIT pseudoscience. I signed that letter. Do I regret signing the letter? I don't regret signing the letter, but I regret that we called it pseudoscience. I didn't pay enough attention to that, and I do regret that, and think we should think about that somewhat differently.
And Dan, can I just check though, as you describe your initial encounter with Tononi, even then, and by the way, just kind of taking it back as well, Dawkins, as he's currently understood, and his role in culture, I mean, he made it into South Park. It's clear that the opposition he's faced for his philosophical views has spilled out into other domains, and he's very much constructed himself in opposition to the opposition, and is, as you know, a combative and in some sense a controversial figure. But when you talk about Tononi's theories, and again, folks, we're going to be scooting over a lot of territory here. Do feel free, Dan, Wikipedia or other places are available if you want to read up after the fact. But you described, when you talked about Tononi's theory, you didn't say that you thought it was right or wrong, or even that you disagreed with it or agreed with it, but you said that you didn't feel that you could fully support it. And I do wonder, and of course it comes straight through into this letter, the extent to which theories, especially about, as it were, popular topics like consciousness, can be factional, right? Is it a question of right or wrong or scientific progress, or is it a question of camps and alliances and so on? I'm referring to the terms that you used to describe your initial encounter.
Yeah, no, thanks. I didn't support it because I thought, although there was a germ of an idea I liked very much in it, I thought there was no way of testing it. It was not, you couldn't turn it into predictive science that really would confirm anything. But I also think a lot of people who didn't like his theory didn't like it for the wrong reasons. So one of the I'm trying to think of an appropriate word for this. One of the ironies of work on consciousness is that the cutting edge of that act, filled with huge egos and big battles and camps and whose side are you on, it's not out of control, but it certainly is daunting. And very often, good ideas are betrayed by fans who think they're good for the wrong reason. And I think Tononi's IIT is a set of ideas that have some promise, but he's with fans like with friends like the friends he's got in his camp. He doesn't need enemies. They're not doing him any favor with the way they endorse it, because they turn it into pseudoscience. But I would like to say that, look, most good ideas start out as, well, if not pseudoscience, then night science. Night science is a term I've recently learned from a few scientists that have a blog by that title. But before I get to them, let me point out that all confirmed evolutionary hypotheses began life as just so stories. Steve Gould and Dick Lewontin, in their notorious classic article on the spandrels of San Marco, heaped scorn on the just so stories of adaptationist evolutionary theory. That was, I think, one of the most misrepresenting one of the worst cases of scientific propaganda I've ever encountered. And it was deleterious to the reputation of many serious scientists. And I went to bat against it as soon as I encountered it carefully. And I just like to point out here, look, if just so stories are unexamined or untested evolutionary hypotheses, all the ones that are confirmed started out that way. So let's go confirm them or disconfirm them. That's the job that Gould and Lewontin, I think, dissuaded many people from doing and held back evolutionary biology by decades. But now let me tell you about night science. I love a phrase that they came up with, by the way, don't anthropomorphize genes. They don't like it. Now that's a great joke. And in a way, you might say it's at Richard Dawkins' expense. But I think Richard would appreciate it as well. When he says that genes are selfish, he's not talking about their hurting their feelings or their being selfish in that sense. They're just talking about them being beautifully designed by natural selection to ruthlessly pursue their mechanical agendas of getting more copies made of themselves. That's what the selfishness is. Okay, now let's talk about some mistakes. One of my bête noire, of course, is Descartes, the dualist. And I think Descartes made a number of mistakes, which are only now really coming into focus, thanks to the progress we've made on the mind and consciousness in recent years. But first, I want to talk about his sort of tactical mistakes. His first tactical mistake was trying to Euclidify knowledge. He wanted to make knowledge like Euclid's geometry. He wanted to have proofs, theorems, definitions, hard edges. He wanted to have necessary and sufficient conditions. And to try to treat all knowledge as deducible from a few basic ideas. That's just wrong. Mathematics is one kind of knowledge, and the rest of science is not Euclidifiable, I don't think. And the goal of making it Euclidifiable, the goal of trying to prove everything the way Euclid proved theorems of plane geometry, has been largely a mistake. It requires, as he pointed out, clear and distinct ideas, and then he was stuck, as he noted in his meditations and in his discourse on method, that how could he trust his clear and distinct ideas? Might he be even wrong about them? And the only fallback he could think of was to call on God for help. And that was a mistake. The best way to find out if your clear and distinct ideas will hold up is not to call on God for help, but to call on your fellow mathematicians and fellow scientists and fellow human beings and get them to help you discuss the strengths and weaknesses of your ideas. We're all in this together, and the idea that God could just guarantee some of your ideas is an idea best discarded. And look what he said back in 16. This is a famous passage. See how it rings today. It is indeed conceivable that a machine could be so made that it would utter words, and even words appropriate to the presence of physical acts or objects, which cause some change in its organs. As, for example, if it was touched in some spot, that it would ask what you wanted to say to it, if in another, that it would cry out that it was hurt, and so on for similar things. But it could never modify its phrases to reply to the sense of whatever was said in its presence, as even the most stupid men can do. Well, we know that's false now. We know that ChatGPT obviously can do exactly what Descartes said was impossible. This is a case of Descartes mistaking a failure of imagination for an insight into necessity. Well, now, I've talked about Descartes' mistakes. How about my own mistakes? Have I ever made big mistakes? I have indeed, and I'd like to take the opportunity to point out one of my biggest ones, one of my most embarrassing ones. This goes way back to 1969, my first book. The Little Man in the Brain, I wrote, Ryle's Ghost in the Machine, is a notorious non-solution to the problems of mind. And although it is not entirely out of the question that the brainwriting analogy will have some useful application, it does appear merely to replace the little man in the brain with a committee. What did I do? Why did that seem like a good idea at the time? Well, I have to confess, I think I was attracted to the punchline. I liked the fact that I could turn it into a sort of a funny quip about a committee. But in fact, I've since come to realize, no, this is progress. That's just what we have to do. We have to turn the little man in the brain into a committee of stupid or littler men. And there's not 1 or 20 or 30 or 3, as Freud thought. There are thousands, maybe millions of little agents that make the committees and cohorts and armies in your brain. And the whole problem of explaining how our consciousness is possible is to take seriously the idea that, as one person once said about my theory of consciousness, yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. Exactly. There are some people find it deeply repugnant that their most wonderful thoughts, their most poetic and thoughts, their most sincere thoughts, their thoughts about those they love and the music they love and all of the rest of their thinking, that all of these thoughts could be produced by huge microscopic hordes of largely incomprehending semi-agents, things like neurons and the parts of neurons, things like motor proteins and ribosomes. We're made of trillions of moving parts. And until we understand how those trillions of moving parts can be coordinated and harnessed, by whom? By each other. There's no boss in there that's in charge. The idea that you have a self that is in charge of your mind is itself a huge mistake and an oversimplification. There is a simplified vision of what you are, which does cohere around a single agent. That's you. I call this the self as the center of narrative gravity. It's like a center of gravity. A center of gravity is not an atom, but it's a perfectly good positive physics. It's an abstraction. It's an oversimplification, but a very valuable one.
Can I just quickly check? And Albert online has been kind of worrying about a similar thing. You're talking about mistakes a lot. You're talking. It feels to me also about things that turn out not to be true, and whether all things that turn out to be true are automatically mistakes. But I'm also really interested, and I think we've spoken about this in a previous conversation, Dan, about this question of failures of imagination. And it does seem to me in your writing, and I think this connects back to this question about popular writing, that in a way, you think that not just popular readers, but also your fellow philosophers are led into error because they simply can't imagine that, as you just said, the thing. And that some of your writing is really sort of trying to help them, help them to imagine a thing. And in that sense, you're trying to help fellow philosophers, to imagine things as much as you are trying to reason with them. Would that be a fair...
Oh yes, thank you. And you're right. And the help that they need is not being sat down in a chair and fed a formal argument with lots of quantifiers and theorems. No, the help they need is they need to be jogged out of their bad habits of thought. And that might take humor. It might take a joke. It might take an intuition pump, as I call it, a tool designed to get them to bump out of their current thinking and have a different intuition about how things are. You've got to surprise people. Sometimes you've got to embarrass them. Sometimes you have to annoy them, just to get them to break out of the ruts that their thinking is in. Now, this is...
I think it's rather democratizing, and I've always thought a charming thought for you that you apply the same approaches to common readers, as it were, and to fellow philosophers. And I think that is one of the great qualities you bring to this.
And not just to philosophers, but to scientists. I have delighted in trying to flummox really wonderful thinkers who seem to me are unable to let go of a bad idea. I mean, I think of people like Francis Crick and Christoph Koch and Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy. I've been able to work with some really brilliant people, but I'm always ready to challenge them if I think they're stuck in a rut of one sort or another. It's very easy to do, and I get stuck in ruts myself. I've confessed to a few here today.
So Julian Jaynes, I think, is the next of the figures that we're bringing to bear, which is great. What did he do for you?
Well, another little confession. I was co-teaching a seminar on consciousness with a psychologist at Tufts many years ago when this book came out in the 70s. And my colleague, Dave Swinney, said, well, we've got to do Julian Jaynes' book, The Origins of Consciousness, the Breakdown of the... I can't remember. I said, you got to be kidding me. That's like some sort of weird cult book. He said, read it, you'll see. I did. He was right. He dragged me into taking Julian Jaynes seriously. And Julian Jaynes, I think, has been victimized by the sort of cult status of his own book, but lots of good ideas in his book that I am happy to acknowledge. I got some of my favorite ideas I got from him, and I'm happy to go on record as counting him as one of the chief sources of some of my favorite thinking, some of the thinking that I'm, I guess, best known for. So Julian...
Just for fun, Dan, for those that are not experts, can you unpack what bicameral means? It's a lovely sort of chocolatey metaphor, isn't it? But what's the word? What's the word?
Oh, well, Julian's thesis, I'm going to give it to you, straight and undoctored, was that that if you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, the people in the Iliad weren't conscious. The people in the Odyssey were. And consciousness could be dated by dating the events that the sack of Troy, in effect.
Never mind octopuses and chimpanzees.
That's right.
He's saying that
people,
the ancient
people
Greeks
themselves were not really conscious
Lovely.
Until Ulysses Odyssey. And just to be provocative, I'll say, I think he's wrong about that, but I think he's wrong by maybe a factor of 10. That is, human consciousness, our kind of human consciousness, was 10 or maybe even 100 times older than the Iliad, but something amazing happened 40,000, 50,000, 100,000 years ago that made a huge difference. And without Julian there to bite that bullet, I don't think I would have arrived at that view. And to this day, I think many philosophers especially would say, Dan just had the wool pulled over his eyes by Julian. No, I don't think so. I'm still prepared to say that human consciousness is much more the product of human culture and human cultural evolution than it is of genetic evolution. The minds that we have depend, of course, on our genetically evolved brains, but they also depend on our culturally evolved thinking tools, all the memes that have taken residence in our brains. And we can't understand human consciousness until we understand that evolution. And we can't understand that evolution until we take memes seriously, because we didn't coin all the words. We didn't create all of these thinking tools. They evolved by cultural evolution. Here are four more iconic.
Dan, just before these fabulous figures, John Online is wondering who the most compelling dualist is in current circles, whether it's just Dave Chalmers.
There are no compelling dualists.
There are none. Thank you, John. There are
none. Dualism is an utterly forlorn view. It has nothing going for it, aside from the fact that some people have got it in their heads that they have a moral obligation to be dualists, because they think if they aren't dualists, then they don't have immortal souls. So it's a sort of a religious thing with them. No, dualism.
They should get over themselves. All right.
Dualism is just a long vital extended to the mind. It's a fantasy that should be studied carefully and then discarded.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. So here are four more of my iconoclasts. This is Lynn Margulis on the upper left. Sue Blackmore, who took the meme idea that Dawkins had developed and that I was working on, and then she has pushed it further. And then in the middle, the smiling lady here that's Elaine Morgan, who put forward the aquatic ape theory. Actually, this is interesting. Lynn Margulis is famous for the idea that the eukaryotic cell was made up of suddenly the word escapes me for the moment. Goodness gracious. Well, never mind.
And I always say I've been forgetting words for as long as I can remember. But
yes, yeah. Anyway, Lynn put forward a theory that she didn't herself first expound, but she's the one who bore the brunt of all the uh, uh, ridicule and stuck up for the idea, and now it's in all the textbooks. Elaine Morgan took Alistair Hardy's idea of the aquatic ape, that our human ancestors had a period when they were shellfish divers and were partly aquatic, and we were going the ways of the seals and the otters and so forth, and then we came back on land. And that's still a theory which I think has something important to offer, and people are slowly coming around to some of it. Sue Blackmore has not just taken up memes, but also the idea that we're now embarking on a third replicator, what she calls tremes, which don't even depend on human beings to be their replicators. They're just replicated by software systems themselves. So they are a third and faster kind of replicator. And I think that the case for them is not only good, but of great importance today. And then Liz Bates was one of the dauntless critics of Noam Chomsky, who was passionately devoted to a non-evolutionary theory of how language came into existence. And she stood up to one of the most powerful and polemical propagandists on the planet for years. So it takes courage and determination to defend unpopular ideas on that cutting edge, and perhaps by giving you examples of ideas that I have initially underestimated or been warded off by colleagues whom I trusted too much to tell me what was worth paying attention to. Maybe this will encourage more people to go out and with open minds and take some of these ideas more seriously. And of course, the price you may pay for this is that you end up supporting a foolish idea, which eventually is proven wrong. That's all right. Make more mistakes, and then at least you'll have something to fix.
So, Dan, we've got a couple of minutes more and a couple more figures that you want to refer to.
Yeah. I'm just in my rogues gallery of iconoclasts. Karl Pribram, famous neuroscientist, neurosurgeon in his day, and he put forward the idea that the hologram was the right model for how the brain stored information. I think I haven't heard anybody support that idea for many years, but he bravely put it forward and won very few converts. But he had plenty of other ideas which were better. And I would say Karl Pribram played an interesting role in my academic life. We were together at a long workshop in Germany when he received an advanced copy of Gerald Edelman's book, The Remembered Present. Edelman's the Nobel laureate biologist who wrote a book on a sort of Darwinian theory of consciousness, and he said to me, "I've just received this book, and I've been asked to review it, but I just don't want to do it. Would you like to do it?" Well, I said yes, and I took his advanced copy and read it through in the next couple of days. I didn't publish a review of it, but I wrote a long letter to Jerry Edelman, and that set off one of the feuds with another heavy hitter, Jerry Edelman, who certainly treated me with antagonism for years afterwards. Let's see, do I have anything more? No, I think
Gibson. Do you not have Gibson?
Oh, yeah, what happened? I went off my.
I'm happy to stop with Pribram, but Gibson, perhaps give us a word or
what
two about
happened? I've
Gibson and
lost
affordances.
I pushed the wrong button.
Don't worry.
And now well, let me just say a word about Gibson. Jimmy Gibson had the idea of affordances.
And so affordances are the thing that things make you want to do to them. I've got my iPod case, and I really want it. It makes me want to gently.
A window affords looking out, and a coffee cup affords drinking, and the idea of affordances is, I think, a lovely idea, and it has a big role to play in any good theory of consciousness. But Gibson, again, was not well served by some of his more radical exponents. Some of his fans turned Gibson into a sort of cult as well. So I guess the message I've been wandering through here today is the cutting edge of science is full of wild ideas, off the wall ideas, some of them good, some of them bad. If you want to get in there and take them seriously, be prepared to take some hard knocks. It's going to be rough going, and you may find that your friends and supporters are doing you no favor because they don't understand what you understand. So, as I tell my students, when they come to me with a big idea that they're not sure is right, I say, look, blurt it out, then you have something to fix. And fixing ideas that are only half-baked, that's a good half. That's a very important half of science. It's not just filling in the blanks and the stuff that we know we've got right. It's fixing the ideas that are almost right, but a little bit crazy.